Much of my early work deals with alcoholism. Yes, and at the biological level. That's what I did my PhD thesis on, and much of my early published papers, where I learned about brain function, because alcohol affects every part of the brain, so I had to learn a lot about the brain. What prompted my interest in that area and your apparent shift to issues clustered around personality? Well, I was always interested in motivation for drug and alcohol abuse, what it was that drove people to use drugs of abuse, let's say. And I got the opportunity to study at McGill under Dr. Robert Peel, who was an excellent supervisor, and he was deeply involved with drug and alcohol abuse research, looking at motivation for alcoholism, and he offered me a position in his lab, and that was what he was working on. And I thought, well, that was one of my cardinal interests, although perhaps not my fundamental interest, which even at that point had to do with motivation for totalitarianism and the commission of atrocity in the service of group belief. But I thought, well, it's a broad topic, and I could learn a lot about biology and neurobiology as a consequence of working on something that was so biological. So my early work in psychology was extremely biologically oriented, and it was unbelievably useful. I learned a lot from the animal experimentalists in particular, people like Jeffrey Gray and later Jaak Panksepp. I have a reading list at jordanbpeterson.com that outlines some of those those books on emotional neuroscience. Why did I shift? Well, there was a variety of reasons. One was that the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, NIAAA, which funded grant research in the United States, essentially made the kind of research I was doing with Robert Peel impossible. And it's part of the consequence. I think this is one of the things that the universities are doing so terribly wrong, is the ethics committees made our research impossible both to fund and to implement. So here's why. So we were bringing people into the lab. So here's who we picked for subjects. If you were going to be a subject in one of our experiments, you had to be a young man, and you had to have an alcoholic father and an alcoholic grandfather, and at least one other first or second degree male alcoholic relative. We would get these subjects. I mentioned who they were. They were young men who weren't alcoholic, but who drank socially, who had an alcoholic father, an alcoholic grandfather, and at least one other male alcoholic relative. Now, why did we pick subjects like that? Well, we knew alcoholism ran in families, and we couldn't really study its transmission in women, because if you're a female alcoholic and you drink when you have a child in utero, then the child can have fetal alcohol syndrome, and whatever abnormalities in psychophysiological response or psychopathologies might be associated with their alcoholism can easily be masked by the presence of fetal alcohol syndrome. So we couldn't use women. And besides, alcoholism is a problem that fundamentally characterizes men, although there are female alcoholics. I think it's 4-to-1, if I remember correctly from those days. It's 4-to-1 male to female. So it was, when we thought if we concentrated on those who had the highest probability of developing alcoholism because of their loaded family history, that we could shed some light on the mechanisms associated with alcoholism, and that would be useful for men and for women. So we studied sons of male alcoholics, sons of multi-generational male alcoholics. Those were our target group. Very hard populations to find. We had people hired full-time to do nothing but find us research subjects, and so we did relatively small end studies because we were lucky if we could gather 4 or 5 subjects a month in the Montreal urban area. Anyways, we did discover a lot about alcoholism. We discovered, for example, that if people with this multi-generational history, a substantial proportion of them, if they drank enough alcohol to move their blood level up above 0.08, which is legal intoxication level, and if they did that relatively short period of time, then their heart rate would increase above, I think the average was about 12 beats per minute compared to the standard control of 0 or 1 or 2. It was very low. And then we did figure out over time, our whole team, that seemed to be a consequence of susceptibility to alcohol's effect on opioid production in the brain and secondary opioid effects on dopamine, which is both opiates and dopamine are primary reward chemicals. So it looked to us like people with multi-generational family histories of alcoholism got an opiate response from alcohol. But we had to get people drunk in order to find this response. And it turned out that 0.08, which was the legal limit at that time for driving, was approximately the place where we saw these psychophysiological effects, and also saw fairly pronounced cognitive and motor effects of alcohol, because we also studied that. So now, we'd bring people into the lab and we'd give them 3 large shots of alcohol that they consumed in 10 minutes. We used laboratory alcohol, which was, I think, 95% pure alcohol. I usually put it in orange juice. And so people would be, reasonably intoxicated. And then we would let them sober up until they were at 0.04, which was half legal intoxication, which we thought was useful. And then we'd put them in a cab and they'd go home. And we had our odd mishap. Now and then someone would throw up, and that was, anyways, now and then we would have somebody who would become ill in the lab, and that was always unpleasant. But then we'd also let people sober up, and it actually takes quite a long time to go from 0.08 to 0.04, especially if you're a big guy, because your dose of alcohol is proportionate to your body weight. And so we used to have people wait in the lab for a couple of hours, and they were not very happy necessarily about having to wait before we paid them and so forth. And if we didn't treat them extraordinarily well, which we tried to do, then of course they were much less likely to come back and participate in another study. And since it was very difficult to get research subjects, then we wanted to treat them very well, apart from the fact that we would have done that anyways. But then NIAAA said, well, you can't let your research subjects go home until they have a blood alcohol level of 0.02. Well, it's like we would have had to have people in our lab, sobering up for 6 to 8 hours. So that made it impossible, because we just couldn't keep people in the lab for that long. All it did was annoy them to death, and then they hated us, and people would get quite irritable and upset, and no bloody wonder. So then also NIAAA decided that half our subjects had to be women or we couldn't get funding. Well, now our subjects couldn't be women. It was impossible to do the kind of research that we were doing with women for the reasons that I just outlined. Well, first of all, alcoholism doesn't affect women as much as it affects men. Depression and anxiety tend to affect women more, and it's perfectly reasonable to study those things, but that isn't what we were doing. And then we couldn't do multi-generational studies for genetic predisposition with women because of the fetal alcohol syndrome problem. And, this was something, I think this came in under the Clintons, this requirement for absolute gender equality in subject selection, and they didn't give a damn if that meant that there were certain kinds of research that just couldn't be done anymore. And so I had to stop doing it. And no one's really doing that kind of research anymore because it's just too difficult. It's like it was always a pain because it was really hard to get the subjects, and then you had to get people quite intoxicated, and then you had to deal with them when they were drunk, and you had to do your psychophysiological recording and all that sort of thing, and then they had to sober up, and it was complicated. Clinical research is unbelievably complicated and difficult. And then you add like 2 more restrictions to it, and people just go, oh, okay, well, I guess we won't study the psychophysiological consequences of alcohol anymore. Or so people would use low doses, and only get their subject's blood alcohol level up to like 0.02 or 0.03, but that's completely irrelevant because alcohol doesn't have much of a physiological effect at those low doses. And so, well, this is one of the things that made me absolutely despise ethics committees, and I believe that the proliferation of ethics committees is one of the reasons that university research, human research, is doing badly. Psychological research is doing badly. There's a variety of reasons, but that's certainly one of them. So I was interested, sorry, this is a very long answer, but I was interested in personality as well, because I was a clinical psychologist and I'd read Freud and Jung and Adler and all the great clinicians of the 20th century. And when I went to Harvard, I was offered, when you're a new faculty member, there's usually a set course that they require you to teach. That's one of the core courses, and then you have some freedom with your other courses. And so I said I'd teach personality. And then I got more and more. And we were looking at personality models with the alcoholism research too. At that point, the Big Five was starting to establish itself. And I wasn't much of an admirer of the Big Five because I like theories as well as empirical research. And I thought the Big Five, well, there was just no theory at all. It was just brute force empiricism. But the data eventually became convincing. And as I got more and more interested in personality, I got more and more interested in the use of personality and other psychometric technologies to predict things like academic and creative success. You see, at McGill, Bob and I, and a variety of other people were using psychological tests of various sorts to predict things like alcoholism and antisocial personality. So we could use the Big Five and neuropsychological tests of dorsolateral prefrontal function, at least in principle, to predict to some degree who might be susceptible to the development of antisocial personality. And then when I went to Harvard, I thought, well, hey, maybe we could use those tests to predict who was going to be good at things as well as who was going to be bad. You know, the people who were creative, or the people who were academically outstanding, or people who did well as managers and administrators in corporations might do well on personality tests and neuropsychological tests that assess dorsolateral prefrontal functions. That's higher order cognition. So we started to put together test batteries that assessed that, and that was fascinating research. I did that with Daniel Higgins, who's my partner in the development of the self-authoring program, and Understand Myself, that things that he's labored for 20 years on before they really became successful. And he wrote a bang-up thesis. I think it was the best thing ever written on the topic of intelligence, and launched that. He started working on it in 1993, which was about the same time that the bell curve came out. And so his research actually became relatively politically contentious, even though all we were trying to do was trying to determine what attributes predicted success among creative people and among managers and administrators and in academia and so forth. Pure empirical research, but it became very rapidly politicized. Anyways, so I just got more and more interested in psychometrics, partly because I realized way back when in 1993 that almost nothing that psychologists measured was actually real. And so we were interested in what was real. And Daniel is an engineer trained at MIT, and so he was a very, very methodical person, and he didn't like to move ahead with his research at all unless he had nailed absolutely everything down in a way that only an engineer and a software coder would. And so we started working on personality models, and I've been doing that and concentrating on that more specifically ever since, as well as writing the more theoretical material that was associated, say, with 12 Rules for Life and Maps of Meaning. So, okay, so that's that answer.